This is update for January 30, 2023, day 341 of the war and of the date update. So today I'm gonna talk a little bit again about China. Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs was pretty aggressive and basically came out and blamed US for the war in Ukraine. They also went on and basically were saying that they will not put up with US aggressive sanctions against Chinese companies. So, as you can see, the rhetoric is going up, it's getting heated more and more. Then, second is I think Chinese Minister of Foreign Affairs is coming to Russia in the 20th, around the 20th of February, and apparently to arrange visit of the Chinese president to Russia, who was invited, and there's no clear answer yet from China whether he's coming or not. So in Russia, there is big hope that this is going to be related to arranging that meeting, preparing that meeting, and also Russian president is gonna made his annual speech around sometime after the 20th of February. Would be very interesting if he's gonna do it on February 24th. But so it looks like there's a lot of might be happening in those between 20th and 24th, 25th of February. Basically, a lot of sort of news. Then also Chinese president visited I think a summit in Latin America where basically he's trying to expand Chinese zone of influence into South America. Usually, it's fully controlled by the US, and this is a very clear attack on what US is perceived as its own turf. Whether it's going to be successful or not remains to be seen. There are some countries there that are, how to say, actively seeking to get out of the US zone of interest, and I would name Argentina being one. Might be some others like Ecuador. So there are countries there that sort of potentially could be good targets for China in the South America. So in terms of further attacks on Iran, it looks like they stopped. So this looks like it was just a slap on the wrist and not sort of start of the serious war or operation there. But remains to be seen, remains to be open. It's very clear that there was not enough damage to stop supply of UAVs to Russia from Iran. In terms of the ballistic missiles, remains to be seen, but I don't think Russia has the problems with missiles in general. It just looks like they're not ready to really hit extremely vulnerable targets in Ukraine yet. So that's more of a question on the Russian leadership side rather than the availability of the means, because they definitely have sort of means to do that. And then there are news that North Korea, well, I guess they are old news, that North Korea is supplying something to Russia, like artillery shells and so on. So what this really means is that China is supplying artillery shells to Russia. There are also some other startups from China being caught supplying satellite images to Russian army and so on. Basically, intelligence and information from Chinese satellites. And just for those who don't know, China launched a lot of satellites. They probably have. I don't want to say for sure, but I think they may have even either a similar number to US or even more than US in terms of satellites in the space. So they really have a huge group of satellites in the space. Now, and then like few words about all of these things. So it looks, I would say it looks strange, because there were sort of a lot of promises, and now they basically kind of like quietly, basically were uh, pulled away from Ukraine. So first was U.S. with the Abrams, which is like, okay, it's going to be end of the year or beginning of 2024. I mean, I would say at that point it's totally irrelevant. And then Challenger 2 looks like it's gonna come sometime in May at best, and maybe even early summer. Again, I would say really late. And probably something like that is happening to Leopard. So there was a lot of sort of propaganda show, and when you really kind of like look at sort of reality on the ground, there is not much to show for it. Oh, I would say there is nothing to show for it, which obviously plays into hand of the Russian propaganda at this point. So it's really, I would say, this whole activity was extremely poorly sought out in the West. And I mean, Ukraine, I mean, you obviously know how critical I am of the Ukrainian leadership, so I'm not surprised about the lack of foresight on, in terms of Ukrainian leadership. That there's just a foregone conclusion there. But I would say lack of thinking in the West is also surprising quite a bit. So anyways, essentially nothing of that is coming, or I would say it's coming when it's the most critical part probably will happen, and it's going to be largely irrelevant essentially, because everybody's expecting this Russian offensive. Nobody knows exactly when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, but it's up in the, how to say, people smell it in the air. There is a tension in the air that's indicating towards that. May still make us sort of wait for another couple of weeks, maybe even 3 weeks, but there is clearly tension up in the air there. Now let's actually talk a little bit about energy policy, but I promised, and I'm gonna start like a little bit discussing the energy system, and then once we understand energy system, I think it will be more clear to understand what can and cannot be done, and and all of this sort of transition to, what is that, alternative energy or new energy is really transition to Stone Age. And you'll understand why it is after we're going to go through everything. But today I'm going to start with sort of one side of it is supply. So we understand what is possible in terms of what our sort of current level of knowledge allows us to get out of the nature, let's put it this way. So we're going to go through different power stations that supply electricity into this kind of like common market. This light is, imagine this is like a one big bucket with electricity that's coming from different sources, right? So let's just go sort of source by source. I'm not going to go through like sort of, I would say, exotic sources, because they just simply cannot move the needle, let's put it this way. So let's first look at this group of sources, which is nuclear, hydro, and geothermal. And I would say geothermal is also kind of like pretty exotic. I think only Iceland can rely pretty much for most of the electricity, power needs on geothermal. Otherwise, it's, I would say, exotic. So the advantages of these two sources, because I'm not sort of, when we're not talking seriously about geothermal, is they are stable. So in other words, it's not intermittent in that sense that you can, reliably have it whenever you need it. Then it's cheap. Both, especially hydro is super cheap. And nuclear is also on the cheap side as well. And they both relatively clean, right? Especially hydro is, well, I'd say they never perfectly clean, all right? And I'll explain a little bit. But, nuclear is obviously less. It's clean when it produces, but it also produces nuclear waste eventually that you need to deal with. So, in a way, you kind of like delaying sort of dealing with the problem. But even hydro is actually not sort of perfectly clean. Just probably most people don't know, but when we build hydro stations around the planet, it actually I think it slows down spinning of the planet basically. So in a way, you can even say that we slightly changing. I don't know in which direction the climate, but it does affect the world we are living. So there's no sort of perfect saying that's really, does not leave any kind of effect on the world we live. Even hydro is not perfect. And I'm not even talking about like, creating issues because you preventing normal flow of water and so on. That's just on top of it. The problem with the nuclear, which actually could have could be much more cleaner, let's put this way, and more reliable and more safer, is that we kind of live in the world of nuclear power stations that are heavily controlled by the governments. It's coming from the time right after World War II, when essentially or let's say majority of these nuclear power plants, they were designed to really produce military grade plutonium for nuclear bombs. That was they were like dual purpose, and because it's dual purpose, it's a lot less safer, the whole process, the whole like functioning of these nuclear power plants. And then the other part is that because governments needed this plutonium and all that, they were sort of intentionally not allowing research in terms of the nuclear reaction in terms of like different ways of doing that and different materials being used, because they really needed that plutonium for the war. So like, okay, let's just do it this way. We're not going to look into other areas. So basically government really heavily controlled this whole ecosystem, and it's because of that it did not develop. There was not research done. There was nothing, because government controls, so the private parties could not invest money, could not research, because it's all nuclear. Like, okay, nobody allowed to be there, but then the government doesn't do anything either. So in other words, we kind of like stuck effectively in, let's say, 50s. Like, we haven't moved much essentially from that time. And there is huge opportunities there. I don't want to speculate about them, but if this was opened up for the sort of private investment, private research, we probably could have created fairly clean sources of energy, and at the same time stable and cheap, that actually can address pollution problems. Because it's somewhat unclear whether the climate or not, but there's very clear, you can clearly say there's a pollution problem. That is undeniable. Because the rest that's actually could be deniable, let's put it this way. And so there is huge opportunity to deal with the pollution through the nuclear, but different ways, different materials, and so on. I think I was reading that you can use thorium instead of uranium for the nuclear reaction and to generate energy. And that thorium is essentially found in coal, and we're going to talk about the coal, and now you probably understand why it's also radioactive. So so in other words, there are better ways to do it, and then the waste is much lower radioactivity, and so on. So there's a lot of basically untapped, unresearched opportunities that we don't even fully understand until we start actually looking into that. And in a way, it was intentionally sort of closed, and sort of research was not allowed in that direction. However, having said all of this, there are inherent problems with hydro and nuclear. To extent, I mean, hydro is obviously limited. I mean, everybody understands. Like some countries don't really have much of it. I think, like for example, Germany pretty much has nothing. There are countries that are super gifted, like Colombia, essentially generates all of the electricity from hydro. And then nuclear, obviously limited. Not every country can have it, and so on, especially if it's could be used for military purposes and so on. So there is obviously natural reaction, okay, to limit the spread of nuclear power plants. And again, this goes back to idea, if you use different materials that are not usable to create nuclear bombs and so on, then it could be much more available. The reactors probably could be much smaller. And the whole thing could be a big opportunity. However, there's a problem with, let's say, nuclear, at least the way it is right now. It has high inertia. So basically, what what this really means, if you have sudden spike in demand from consumers, you cannot just simply just jump it up. It takes a while. It's just very it's like a diesel car in a way. Like it's just slowly taking off before it ramps up and reaches a certain level, and then it stays at that level. It's sort of like it's better not to kind of like it cannot really oscillate up and down like as needed. I mean, it can, but it's not ideal, let's put it this way. You do more operations in terms of putting roads, and the more you do those things, the more chances of things going wrong and so on. So you kind of like you kind of want to this is basically natural sort of limitation of the nuclear and the way we know it right now, the way we practice it right now. The other limitation is this there are technical problems and so on. A nuclear power plant is nuclear reactor is relatively big in terms of one unit producing quite a bit of energy. So if it's off, you suddenly have a huge gap in your energy supply, unless you have like whatever, like 100 reactors, which is essentially pretty much nobody has that. So in other words, let's say you have like 10 reactors, right? So 1/10 of your electricity is gone, let's put this way, or something like that. Basically, it can create huge holes because of that. And you really need to be very careful about nuclear reactors. So, something even like, probably nothing major, but you really want to stop regardless because you want to be extra safe. So that's just natural limitation, but they're excellent for the base load because there is always certain level of electricity that's sort of demanded no matter what. And so the supply, that base load, they're excellent. And as I said, they're relatively cheap and, I would say pretty cheap and relatively clean. So this was about this sort of relatively I'd say overall positive sources of energy. Then what we have, if we go down, there we have just like conventional power plants, and they could be fired by natural gas. So that's one. This one is really sort of opposite of, let's say, nuclear or hydro, where there's high inertia. This is really like low inertia. Press the button, it jumps to address the energy need as soon as possible. It's relatively clean, stable, right? So there are a lot of positives about it. There are also negatives. First of all, you don't have natural gas everywhere. I would say many countries don't have it. And then it's not terribly cheap. It's actually kind of like in between. So and the price of gas is fairly volatile unless it's, let's say, how it used to be, where it's a long-term contracts, but now it's more switching to like a market base, where you buy in the market and sort of use it. So basically, the price is not that low. Let's put it this way, but it has a lot of other positives. Then let's switch to them. So this natural gas kind of like in the middle, and then let's switch to sort of like let's say, not ideal sources of energy is could be heating oil, basically diesel using, or coal. So with heating oil, the same positives, low inertia, then also big positive, it's widely available, and it's stable. The negative is medium cost, and it's dirty. So for that reason, they are not as sort of popular, let's put it this way, not widespread. But let's actually look at the coal, because they are basically staple. I would say they are terrible in terms of creating pollution. The prime example would be China. There's horrific pollution there is significantly due to the extensive use of coal power generators. And the reason they are so widespread, because there are a couple things. They are super cheap. They're dirty cheap because the coal is dirty cheap. And that's a really main driver behind them. At the same time, they're super dirty. Not only pollution, they also create a lot of radiation around them. Like, I wouldn't say radius, but it also depends on where wind blows. But basically, where the direction where most of the time wind blows, there is like a shadow of like up to 50 kilometers of basically higher than normal radioactivity area that covered with higher than normal radiation. So basically, they pretty nasty. Let's put it this way. The other reason why they're so popular is, coal is widely available, pretty much, or you can bring it very easily. It's cheap, so cheap plus widely available make it, and then low inertia, and then stable. So it's almost like ideal from many angles, except for the pollution, right? Terrible pollution, and that's why they mostly used in developing. I mean, they used to be everywhere, but right now the developed world mostly switched to, let's say, natural gas, and then nuclear, hydro, and so on. And then we'll talk about the sort of so-called alternatives. But the developing world is where it's all of this pollution is coming, essentially, and when basically they poison. That's effectively what China is doing to itself, and they realize that. But that's a price they're willing to pay to become a developed world. So hopefully you understand why coal is absolutely not ideal, let's put it this way. And now let's move to so-called alternative energy. Let's just look at solar, wind as two most sort of popular ones. The most important actually problem with them is that they are intermittent, right? So that means, like, okay, you can have it, you may not have it, especially with the wind. And then they're very limited. You cannot use solar in many places, especially, let's say, in the northern hemisphere, where the most of the developed world is. There's very limited opportunity for solar. Like in Ukraine, essentially all winter you don't really have sun, basically. I mean, you have sometimes, but it's essentially nothing. And so in order for you to collect enough energy, you really need like huge territories taken up by solar. And then there's wind, the same idea. There are areas where there's plenty of wind and so on, but for the most part, it's not, widely available everywhere you want. So again, they have maybe their sort of place in the whole ecosystem. And this is something important I didn't mention, that they all together create ecosystem that's sort of self-regulating. And the way it's self-regulating is based on price, and we will go there. And then we'll go why this ecosystem has been broken. But basically, these two, they limited, intermittent, and then also expensive. Relative to everything else, they're much more expensive. So that's for that reason they sort of don't have wide adoption, and the only reason you see a lot of them is because of the government subsidies. Absent subsidies, they would essentially pretty much don't exist. There is some positives in them in terms of, like, let's say if you're doing like off grid and stuff like that house, and like, yeah, that's very good approach, but it's basically very niche sources of energy that where there is, in a way, like a dictatorship desire or tyrannical desire. Okay, let's make them base load, like a base sources of energy, and let's just cut everything, destroy, like, let's kill everything else, and let's just sort of have this too, essentially, which will never work. And that's why I was saying that this so-called transition is really transition to Stone Age, because this too will simply not be able to supply what is needed. And then there is also a lot of questions about their cleanliness, like solar. First of all, it's pretty dirty to manufacture solar panels. It's fairly toxic process, using some lithography, and so you're using very toxic chemicals, first of all, then disposing of it, because the expected lifespan, let's say 20, at most 25 years. After that, you have a lot of electronic waste, and again, it's toxic. So and again, that's a problem, right? So this sort of so-called cleanliness is basically you transferring dirt from one place to another and saying, oh, okay, well, we're gonna have waste in somewhere else, but we're gonna be clean here. So it doesn't, but if you look holistically at everything, you have that sort of waste and dirt and pollution and so on, right? So you're just kind of like hiding it under the rug and saying, oh, everything's clean, which is obviously not true. The wind ones are sort of less, kind of like dirty. That's just steel and so on. But at the same time, if you really compare on apples to apples, let's say to natural gas power plant, wind is more expensive. So it really means that you're creating more actually pollution to actually have wind energy, because the price is really tells you how much resources you're putting into making, let's say, 1 unit of kilowatt at let's say natural gas power plant versus wind power plant, right? And because it's more expensive, it tells you that you use more resources, and therefore you're creating more pollution, right? So even this simple like logic kind of tells you, okay, they're not sort of so-called clean, they're actually creating more pollution, creating more problem than actually solving the problem. And that's a whole big problem in our world, that one path, which is nuclear, has been blocked completely, and then there's tremendous amount of resources that were wasted on solar and wind, and that really comes back by undermining sort of like living standards. because this is all wasted, wasted capital that never will be sort of recovered and so on, and it makes everyone poorer, with the exception of few people who benefit from this. Like for example, I can explain how it works. So like how this, some people may like wonder like how does this work? So I'll give you example of Ukraine how it works. So this solar and wind is super expensive, right? And most of the customers would not buy it, and by customers I mean just regular consumer, like let's say myself or whoever. It's especially for country like Ukraine, where the standard of living is not that high. Nobody would ever buy that stuff because it's like 3-4 times more expensive than, actually probably even more than that, like 5-6 more times more expensive than what currently people used to pay. And in Ukraine, as I said, a lot of it is coming from nuclear. It's a mix: nuclear, hydro, some natural gas, and some coal. So it's a mix of those four. And then obviously now there is solar and wind. And by the way, pretty much all of that solar and wind was lost. It's under Russian, it's on occupied territories by Russia right now. But anyway, so how it used to work. So because it's expensive, then and the government sort of basically guaranteeing, like let's say prices of electricity like 5-6-7 times more than sort of normal price on the market. So if you go to this market, it's basically much lower. But the whoever invests in this gets price that's like, as I said, 5-6-7 times more. And obviously, but there is a problem that consumers are not willing to pay that price, right? Because it's much higher. So what it does, what the government did, they blend this super expensive electricity with the electricity that's coming from this much cheaper sources. And so what they did, is they basically, but you collect still, money from the consumers that basically doesn't cover up this, right? This expensive solar and wind. So what they did, they stopped paying, let's say, nuclear. They found like in hydro. So basically they essentially don't pay them. And then they channel money to solar and wind. That's what sort of initial trick was. Then that stopped working because this two don't get enough, and actually then also coal, natural gas, they basically don't get enough maintenance. They cannot buy natural gas, coal, or nuclear roads. So they were like, there was essentially a threat of like impending blackouts in the country. So what the government did then, they actually borrowed money on international markets, basically issued bonds to pay money to the so-called investors who stand behind solar and wind. So you can imagine what, like, hopefully that this boggles your mind that basically it's a rip-off scheme of the entire society for the benefit of few people who stand behind this solar and wind developments. And just for the reference, this is really has been started by this Ukrainian President Yanukovych, who was ousted during the revolution in 2014, who was really pro-Russian. So basically, there was a bunch of oligarchs around him, and he basically handed out licenses for this solar and wind developments to his sort of, call it, friends and close circle, because everybody understood that this is basically rip-off scheme wasn't really about general producing, generating electricity through solar and wind, because it's too expensive. Everybody understood that this is not viable on its own as a business idea. But they realized that they can basically use the state finances, and rip off money from there to pay themselves handsomely. And that's what's been going on since essentially 2011, when it started, plus minus. And only the war kind of like essentially crashed this whole thing. And so I'm explaining this just to kind of like give you an idea that something very similar is happening, in the West. And the problem is that the price is blended, as you can see here. So basically, like, you have one bucket where it goes at sort of more or less unified price to the consumer. And in some countries there is separation between industrial consumer and sort of like a consumer. But still, this in the end, it's not like you as a consumer can say, okay, I will buy blend that is 50% nuclear, 10% hydro, and the rest is solar, for example. I'll say, I want 100% solar, and I'll pay, I don't know, $1 per kilowatt, like just making up numbers, right? So there's no that, and because it's also government control more or less everywhere markets. So the reason for all of this in general, this whole problems, is government monopoly on energy markets pretty much everywhere you can go. Maybe it's not like some countries, it's sort of more relaxed, but it's pretty strongly controlled by the government, and that whole thing makes it a horrific place and bad for the consumer. Right now it's bad from the price perspective, from a blackout perspective, but it also creates problem from the pollution. And hopefully you understand that this is sort of false hope, false solution that eventually will fall apart. But the problem is that a lot of capital has been sort of wasted already over past, let's say, 20 years, and still being wasted. And in the end, it will lead to decline in the living standards, let's say, in a way, everywhere you practice this. So this is just kind of like the beginning of it. We'll discuss a little bit more in terms of the demand and how the whole system, works more, and so on. And then I just want to quickly mention about these accumulators. This is not standalone. It's actually, like, for example, for example, in Ukraine, you have special water reservoirs where you pump the water when you produce electricity. Let's say at night it's not needed, and you can basically accumulate energy by pumping water somewhere and then using up that water as sort of as hydro, but except it's pumped. So that potentially, if let's say you have this wind and solar and these accumulators, that solves potentially problem of intermittency. But again, this is very limited. Like, there are only very few opportunities to do that kind of stuff. Let's say Ukraine has those, but many countries don't. And so you really cannot solve this intermittency problem for solar and wind. Okay, that's it for today for this topic. Let's actually look what's going on the battlefield in Ukraine. First of all, we're going to start in a clockwise fashion, as I always do, and then we're going to we're going to start in the north, and then we're going to slowly move south, and then, at this point, just south without really much west. So the situation along the state border is more or less the same. No special sort of changes or anything there. Let's jump to the North Lugansk front line. So here things are similar. Initiative is in Russian hands at this point. And as you can imagine, as you can see, they hammering more or less the same place. So like I think for third day or fourth day, in this, here between Tern and Zarechna. Now a little bit new sort of direction now is this Kuzemivka, apparently with the goal Kupiansk. But so far everything is sort of in balance here for both sides, and no sort of immediate threat here for Ukrainian side. Now let's move to the North Lugansk, North Donbass, where there are problems obviously for Ukrainian side, and things are not going well. However, to date there were no sort of visible losses, problems. Wagner mercenaries continuing their pressure. As you can see, they super active, super aggressive in this area where they trying to outflank. So which very clear, straightforward. They moving sort of west and trying to put pressure from the north on Bakhmut. Similar situation here from the south, where they're trying to get as close to Ivanivsky, but so far today there was no big losses today. But as I said many times before, the problems remains the same. It's just a question of time. Basically, Wagner mercenaries is much better organization than Ukrainian army as an organization, and so that it's in a way, think about this as a war of organizations, and whichever organization is better, that's who's gonna win. And Wagner mercenaries happen to be better organization. And even though Ukrainian side is saying, oh, there are so many dead Wagner mercenaries, fine, that's true, no question about that. But the problem is that Ukrainian side is losing, if not the same, but close to the same number, and Ukraine simply cannot afford to lose that. And so in this war of attrition, basically, if nothing changes, then Wagner mercenaries already won, essentially. They just need to continue executing on their strategy. So now let's move south. Let's look at what's going on in the central Donbass front line. So here you can see this whole offensive's fizzled out. In Marinka, they even stopped completely Russian regular troops attacks. So this is again contrasting, right? Wagner mercenaries, regular Russian army, completely incapable, tons of losses for nothing, couldn't even show anything for that. Ukrainian army can sort of wage the war with that kind of army. They basically more or less the same, because again, this is about organizations, the same kind of basically Soviet organizations. So they sort of worse each other, and so there is a balance. And the problem is that there are Wagner mercenaries, and as I said, they prove their worth to the Russian president, so he will be channeling more resources towards them. It's in a way kind of like similar how it was in Germany when there was a regular German army and Waffen-SS, right? As Waffen-SS was sort of showing, I'd say, I don't know, maybe results, maybe not, but at least they were sort of more better fighters, or at least perceived that way. So there were more resources channeled to them, especially towards the end of the war. So something similar dynamic is going to be happening with Wagner mercenaries, basically, as the war progresses. And that's really a big problem for Ukraine, for Ukrainian army, and for Ukraine as a country, and for Ukrainian citizens. Because as I said before, Ukraine military command will not be able to successfully deal with Wagner group as an organization. Now let's finish with the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are quiet for now after those probing attacks here between Kaminsky and Orikhi, basically between Kaminsky and actually Gulyai-Pilsky, this sector, the most western one. Russian command decided not to pursue attack here, at least at this point. We'll see what happens in the near future. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow, bye bye.